The sun burned like a merciless eye across the Arizona territory, casting long shadows that offered no relief from the scorching heat. Jack pulled his weathered hat lower over his face, squinting through the shimmering waves of heat that rose from the desert floor. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Belle, moved with the careful steps of an animal that knew the danger of this land. Jack had been riding for 3 days straight, carrying news from Fort Apache to the settlement at Prescott. The leather saddlebags bounced rhythmically against Belle's flanks, containing dispatches that could mean the difference between peace and war in this volatile territory. The year was 1882, and tensions between the Apache tribes and the white settlers had reached a breaking point. As the afternoon wore on, Jack noticed something troubling. Belle's ears kept flicking forward, alert to sounds he couldn't hear. Her nostrils flared as she tested the wind, picking up scents that made her nervous. Jack had learned to trust his horse's instincts during his years as a territorial messenger. Belle had saved his life more than once by sensing danger before he could. "Easy, girl," he murmured, patting her neck. "What's got you spooked?" The answer came sooner than he expected. As they crested a small rise, Jack saw smoke rising in thin columns from a depression ahead. His heart sank as he recognized what those smoke patterns meant. Apache signals. He was riding straight into territory controlled by warriors who had every reason to hate anyone wearing his uniform. Jack reined Belle to a halt and considered his options. He could turn back, but that would add 2 days to his journey, and the dispatches he carried were urgent. He could try to circle around, but that would take him into even more dangerous country where water was scarce. Or he could continue forward and hope that luck would favor him one more time. The decision was made for him when he heard the distinctive whistle of arrows cutting through the air. Belle reared as the first arrow embedded itself in the ground just inches from her front hooves. More arrows followed, creating a deadly barrier that cut off any hope of retreat. "Steady, Belle," Jack called out, fighting to control his frightened horse. He could see them now, Apache warriors emerging from behind rocks and scrub brush where they had been perfectly concealed. Their faces were painted for war, and their eyes held the cold determination of men who had lost too much to the advancing tide of white settlement. One warrior stepped forward, clearly the leader. He was tall for an Apache, with broad shoulders and scars that spoke of many battles. His hair was bound with eagle feathers, and red paint streaked across his cheeks in patterns that Jack didn't recognize. When he spoke, his English was clear but heavily accented. "You ride Apache land, white man. Turn back or die." Jack slowly raised his hands, showing he meant no immediate threat. "I'm carrying messages for the territorial government. No weapons for fighting, just papers." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Papers that steal more of our land, papers that lie about treaties broken before ink is dry." He gestured to his warriors, and Jack heard the unmistakable sound of rifle bolts being worked. "We know what your papers mean." "Wait," Jack said, his mind racing. He had to buy time, had to find some way to convince them to let him pass. "I'm not a soldier, I don't make the treaties, I just carry messages." "All white men are soldiers when they take our hunting grounds," the leader replied. "When they poison our water holes, when they drive away the deer and the elk." His voice grew harder with each word. "When they take our children to their schools and teach them to forget they are Apache." Around them, the other warriors began to close in. Jack counted at least 12, all armed with rifles that looked well-maintained and ready for use. These weren't desperate renegades fighting a hopeless cause. These were skilled fighters defending their homeland with the confidence of men who knew every rock and stream for miles around. "Your chiefs in Washington promise peace," the leader continued, "but their promises are like morning mist, gone when the sun rises." He raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Jack's chest. "Today, the mist burns away." Jack felt sweat beading on his forehead that had nothing to do with the desert heat. He had been in dangerous situations before, but never one where he felt so completely outmatched. These warriors could have killed him already if they wanted to. The fact that they were talking meant they wanted something, or they were following some custom he didn't understand. "If you're going to kill me," Jack said quietly, "at least tell me why. What happened to bring you to this?" The leader's expression flickered, showing a hint of surprise at the question. For a moment, the hard mask of war paint seemed to soften, revealing the face of a man carrying a tremendous burden of grief and anger. "2 moons ago," he said slowly, "soldiers came to our village. They said we must move again to land where nothing grows, where our horses grow thin and our children cry from hunger." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. When we refused, they took our girls, 3 of them, said they would go to the school in Carlisle, far from their people, far from their mothers. Jack felt his heart sink. He had heard about the Indian schools, places where native children were sent to be civilized. The official policy was to kill the Indian and save the man, stripping away everything that made them who they were. He had never thought much about it before, but seeing the pain in this warrior's eyes made the reality hit home. One of those girls was my daughter, the leader continued. Eternal blossom. She was learning the old ways from her grandmother, learning the songs that keep our people connected to the spirits of this land. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his rifle. Now she learns to be ashamed of who she is. The other warriors murmured their agreement, and Jack could see the same pain reflected in their faces. These weren't mindless killers. They were fathers, brothers, uncles who had watched their families torn apart by policies they had no voice in making. I'm sorry, Jack said, and meant it. I truly am, but killing me won't bring your daughter back. No, the leader agreed, but it will send a message that some things cannot be taken without cost. He raised his rifle again, and Jack saw his finger tighten on the trigger. That was when they heard the sound that changed everything. From the direction of the Apache camp came the voices of young girls, singing in their native language. The melody was haunting and beautiful, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo across the desert landscape. The leader's rifle wavered, and for a moment his warrior's mask slipped completely away. The other Apache men looked toward the sound with expressions of wonder and confusion. It was clear they recognized the voices, but something about the song was unexpected. That is impossible, one of the younger warriors whispered in Apache. Jack didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The leader lowered his rifle, his eyes wide with disbelief. He breathed, but how? As the singing continued, Jack began to make out movement in the distance. 3 young girls were approaching the group, walking with the careful dignity that Apache women were taught from childhood. But something was different about them. Their clothes were the simple dresses of the government schools, not the traditional clothing of their people. Their hair had been cut short in the white style, yet they moved with the grace and bearing of Apache princesses, and their voices carried the ancient songs of their ancestors. The leader looked from the approaching girls to Jack and back again, confusion and hope warring in his expression. How did they escape? How did they find us here? Jack was wondering the same thing. The Indian school in Carlisle was thousands of miles away, and these girls couldn't be more than 12 or 13 years old. How had they managed to travel across the continent and find their way back to this specific spot in the vast Arizona desert? As the girls drew closer, Jack could see that they bore markings on their hands and arms. Not the traditional tattoos of their people, but something else. Symbols that looked almost like maps, drawn in what appeared to be ink or charcoal. The markings covered their skin in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the wavering desert heat. The leader stepped forward, his rifle forgotten. My daughter, how did you come to be here? The girl, who was clearly his daughter, looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. When she spoke, her voice carried the soft accent of the Eastern schools, but her words were Apache. Father, we have been traveling for many weeks. The spirits guided us home, but the journey is not finished. She gestured to her companions, 2 girls who bore similar markings on their skin. We carry knowledge now, knowledge that was not meant for us, but which the spirits have made our own. Jack stared at the markings on the girls' arms and hands, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The patterns looked random at first, but as he studied them more carefully, he began to recognize shapes. Mountain ranges, river courses, landmarks that he knew from his years of traveling through the territory. One of the other girls, a thin child with enormous dark eyes, stepped forward. The white teachers at the school, they tried to make us forget our people, but they taught us other things too, how to read their maps, how to understand their symbols. She held up her arm, showing the intricate markings that covered her skin. We took their knowledge and made it ours. The third girl nodded. Every night we would study the maps in the school library. We memorized every trail, every water source, every safe place between Carlisle and our home. She smiled, an expression of fierce pride. Then we used their own knowledge to find our way back to our people. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening beginning to cool around them. These girls had essentially tattooed a roadmap across their bodies, turning their own skin into a navigation system that would allow them to traverse thousands of miles of dangerous territory. It was an act of incredible courage and intelligence. But it was also something more. As Jack looked more closely at the markings, he began to see patterns that went beyond simple geography. There were symbols that looked like military positions, supply routes, and strategic locations that would be valuable to either Apache warriors or U.S. cavalry units. The leader saw his expression and stepped closer. "You recognize something in these markings, white man." Jack nodded slowly. "Some of these patterns, they're not just maps of the land, they're maps of people, military movements, supply lines." He looked up at the Apache leader with growing respect. "Your daughters didn't just escape from school, they turned themselves into living intelligence reports." Smiled, and for the first time Jack could see the family resemblance between father and daughter. "The white teachers thought they were civilizing us. They did not know they were training us to better defend our people." The implications of what these girls had accomplished began to sink in. They had not only managed an impossible escape and journey home, but they had done so while gathering intelligence that could shift the balance of power in the ongoing conflict. The markings on their skin contained information that both sides would kill for. Jack found himself facing a decision that would affect not just his own survival, but the lives of everyone involved in the territorial conflicts. The dispatches in his saddlebags contained orders that would likely escalate the fighting. The knowledge carried by these remarkable girls could either end the conflict or make it far more deadly. As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that matched the war paint on the Apache faces around him, Jack realized that his simple message-carrying mission had become something far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. The Apache camp lay hidden in a narrow canyon where water seeped from red rock walls, creating a small oasis in the harsh desert landscape. Jack found himself in the strangest situation of his life, sitting cross-legged around a small fire with warriors who had been ready to kill him just hours before. The three girls who had changed everything sat nearby, their marked arms and hands visible in the flickering firelight. His father, who had introduced himself as, studied Jack with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. The Apache leader had agreed to hear what Jack had to say before deciding his fate, but the messenger knew he was walking on a knife's edge. One wrong word could still mean death. "Tell me about these papers you carry," said quietly. "What do your chiefs in Washington plan for my people now?" Jack hesitated. The dispatches in his saddlebags contained sensitive military information, orders that he was sworn not to reveal. But looking at the faces around the fire, seeing the pain and determination etched in every line, he felt the weight of a larger oath, an oath to basic human decency. "The territorial governor wants to relocate all Apache bands to a reservation in New Mexico," Jack said slowly. "A place called. The military is being ordered to round up any groups that resist and force them to move within 60 days. The warriors around the fire exchanged glances, their expressions growing darker. Jack could see hands moving instinctively toward weapons, and he quickly continued. "But there's more. The governor believes that some Apache groups are getting information about military movements from an unknown source, someone who understands both Apache tactics and army procedures." Jack looked directly at. "They think there's a spy in their ranks." Spoke up from across the fire, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed strange in someone so young. "They are not wrong, white man, but they do not understand the nature of their problem." She stood and moved closer to the fire, rolling up the sleeves of her school dress to reveal more of the intricate markings on her arms. In the firelight, Jack could see details he had missed before. The symbols weren't just maps and military positions. There were also what looked like schedules, dates, and numbers that could represent troop strengths or supply quantities. "At the Carlisle school, we were taught to be ashamed of our people," continued. "But we were also taught to read and write in the white man's language. We learned mathematics and geography and history." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "They taught us to think like white people so we could serve them better. They did not expect us to use that thinking to serve our own people instead." Her companion, the thin girl with the large eyes who called herself, stepped forward. "The teachers like to talk about their important work, training savage children to be civilized. They did not think we understood when they discussed the military campaigns against our families." She showed her own markings, pointing to a series of symbols that looked like a schedule. "We listened very carefully." Jack felt his understanding of the situation shifting like sand beneath his feet. You're telling me that you gathered military intelligence while you were students at the Indian school. More than that, said the third girl who went by the name. We made friends with other students, girls from many different tribes, Navajo, Pueblo, Cherokee, Lakota. When they received letters from home, we learned about conditions on many reservations. She traced one of the markings on her hand. We began to see patterns that the white teachers could not see. Leaned forward, his expression intense. What kind of patterns? Looked to her companions, and something passed between them, some silent communication that spoke of bonds forged in adversity. The government is not just trying to control Apache people, Father. They are trying to control all native peoples. The same tactics being used here are being used everywhere. She began pointing to different symbols on her arms, explaining what each one meant. Supply routes that connected distant military posts. Schedules that showed coordinated movements across multiple territories. Financial records that revealed how much money Washington was spending on the Indian problem. The three of us spent 2 years gathering this information, said. 2 years of pretending to be good students while we memorized everything that could help our people survive. She looked directly at Jack. When we finally decided to escape, we had to choose what knowledge to carry with us. Jack stared at the markings covering the girl's skin, beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had accomplished. You turned your bodies into a living library of military intelligence. Intelligence that could save many lives, said quietly, or cost many lives depending on how it is used. The Apache leader stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, staring out into the darkness beyond the canyon. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of terrible responsibility. For generations, my people have fought to protect our land and our way of life. We have won many battles, but we are losing the war. He turned back to face Jack. The white man's strength is not just in his numbers or his weapons. It is in his ability to plan many moves ahead, like a chess player who sees the whole board. Jack nodded, understanding where this was leading. And now your daughters have given you the ability to see the board too. Perhaps, but knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, and knowledge used in anger can destroy those who wield it. Looked at each of the three girls in turn. These children have taken a great risk to bring this gift to their people. The question now is what their people will do with it. Stepped forward, her young face serious beyond her years. Father, we did not endure 2 years of captivity and weeks of dangerous travel just to watch our knowledge go unused. Our people are scattered, fighting separate battles against an enemy that sees them as one problem to be solved. What are you suggesting? One of the other warriors asked. Unity, said simply. The markings we carry contain information about all the southwestern tribes. Not just Apache, but Navajo, Pueblo, even some of the California bands. If this information was shared, if the tribes could coordinate their resistance instead of fighting alone. The implications hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Jack realized he was witnessing something that could change the entire nature of the conflict in the Southwest. The scattered resistance of individual bands could become a coordinated campaign that would be far more difficult for the army to suppress. But it could also lead to a level of violence that would make the current conflicts look like minor skirmishes. There is a risk, said, reading Jack's thoughts. If the tribes unite, if they use this knowledge to strike coordinated blows against the army, the response from Washington will be swift and brutal. They will send more soldiers, more guns. The fighting could spread across the entire territory. Moved to stand beside her father. And if we do nothing, our people will be ground down one band at a time until none are left. The white government has shown us their plan, Father. They mean to destroy everything that makes us Apache, even if they let our bodies survive. Jack found himself in the uncomfortable position of seeing both sides of an impossible situation. As a messenger for the territorial government, his duty was clear. He should deliver his dispatches and report what he had learned here. But as a man who had spent years traveling through Apache country, who had seen the dignity and courage of these people, he felt a deeper obligation to something more than official policy. There might be another way, he said quietly. All eyes turned to him, and Jack felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. He was about to propose something that could cost him his job, his reputation, possibly his life. But the alternative was to watch a conflict escalate into something that would consume everyone involved. The information your daughters carry, it works both ways, he continued. You now know how the army thinks, how it plans, how it coordinates its operations. but you also know its weaknesses, its supply lines, its communication problems, its political pressures. His eyes narrowed. You suggest we use this knowledge for war. No, I suggest you use it for something the army doesn't expect, something they're not prepared for. Jack took a deep breath. Negotiation from a position of strength. The warriors around the fire began to murmur among themselves, some sounding intrigued, others skeptical. Jack pressed on before he could lose his nerve. Every military commander knows that the worst kind of war is the one where you can't predict what your enemy will do next. If the Apache bands could demonstrate that they understand Army operations better than the Army understands Apache operations, it might convince certain people in Washington that a negotiated settlement is preferable to a prolonged conflict. Tilted her head, studying Jack with an expression that reminded him uncomfortably of a hawk evaluating prey. You speak of showing strength through knowledge rather than violence, but the white leaders we have seen respect only force. Some do, Jack admitted, but others understand that force is expensive, wars cost money, and politicians have to justify that expense to voters who are more concerned with their own problems than with territorial conflicts. He gestured to the markings on the girl's arms. You have information about those costs now. You know which campaigns are draining the treasury, which ones are politically unpopular back east. Stepped closer, her large eyes bright with interest. We do know these things. The teachers at school often complained about how much money was being spent on what they called pacification programs. They seemed to think the Eastern politicians were growing tired of paying for distant wars. Exactly. And if the right people in Washington could be convinced that a negotiated peace would be cheaper than continued fighting, that might create opportunities that don't exist now. Jack looked around the circle of faces. But it would require a level of coordination and discipline that has never been attempted before. Was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeing visions in the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. What you suggest is not the way of our fathers. Apache warriors have always fought as independent bands, following their own chiefs, making their own decisions. He looked at his daughter. But our fathers did not face enemies who could bring thousands of soldiers across the land in iron horses, or send messages instantly across vast distances with talking wires. The world has changed, father, said softly. Perhaps we must change with it or watch our people disappear like morning mist. As the fire burned lower and the desert night grew cool around them, Jack realized that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. He was no longer just a messenger carrying dispatches from one official to another. He had become part of something larger and more dangerous than any individual mission. The three remarkable girls sitting around the fire had transformed themselves into living repositories of strategic knowledge. Now the question was whether that knowledge would be used to wage war or wage peace. And somehow, Jack, a simple territorial messenger, had found himself in a position to influence that decision. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden as the last flames flickered and died, leaving them all in darkness under the brilliant stars of the Arizona night. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hidden canyon as Jack made the most difficult decision of his life. The dispatches in his saddlebags represented his sworn duty to the territorial government, but the three Apache girls and their precious knowledge represented something larger than any single oath of service. I need to send a message to Fort Apache, Jack announced to the assembled group, but not the message I was ordered to deliver. Studied the white messenger with eyes that missed nothing. You would betray your own people for strangers. I would serve a higher loyalty than the one I swore to politicians who have never set foot in this territory, Jack replied. The girls are right. What's happening here is part of something bigger, and if we don't find a way to change the pattern, it's going to destroy everyone involved. Stepped forward, her marked arms catching the morning light. What kind of message would you send, Jack? Jack had been thinking about this through the sleepless hours of the night. A warning. The military commanders at Fort Apache need to understand that their usual tactics aren't going to work anymore, that they're facing an enemy who knows their plans as well as they do. He gestured to the intricate markings on the girl's skin. Your daughters have made that possible. And if they don't believe the warning? Asked, her large eyes serious. Then we make them believe, Jack said simply. The markings you carry, they're not just intelligence, they're proof that the Apache people have capabilities the Army never suspected. tilted her head, studying Jack with the same intense focus he had noticed the night before. "You speak of we, white man. You would stand with us against your own government." Jack felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Once he spoke the words he was considering, there would be no taking them back. He would be crossing a line that would make him a traitor in the eyes of some, a collaborator in the eyes of others. But as he looked at the faces around him, faces of people who had shown him courage and intelligence and dignity in the face of impossible odds, he knew there was only one answer he could live with. "I've spent 5 years carrying messages back and forth across this territory," he said. "I've seen what the current policies are doing to everyone involved. Soldiers dying in ambushes they could have avoided, settlers living in constant fear, Apache families torn apart and scattered to the winds." He met gaze directly. "None of this has to continue, but it will continue unless someone finds the courage to try a different path." The Apache leader was quiet for several moments, considering. Around the fire, the other warriors waited for his decision, their faces impassive but their hands never far from their weapons. Jack realized that his life still hung in the balance. Trust, once offered, could be withdrawn as quickly as it had been given. "If we work together," said finally, "what exactly do you propose?" Jack pulled out a piece of paper from his saddlebag, one of his official message forms. "First, I write a letter to Colonel Harrison at Fort Apache, not as his messenger, but as a concerned citizen who has discovered something that threatens the security of the entire territory." "What would this letter say?" asked. "The truth, that Apache resistance has become far more sophisticated than anyone realizes, that continuing the current military campaign will result in casualties and costs that Washington cannot sustain." Jack began writing as he spoke. "And that there is an opportunity for negotiation, but only if it happens quickly, before the situation escalates beyond control." Moved closer, reading over his shoulder as he wrote, "You do not mention us specifically." "No, I say that I encountered Apache representatives who demonstrated detailed knowledge of military operations. I recommend that the colonel request permission to open negotiations through unofficial channels." Jack looked up at her. "If this works, you three will need to remain secret weapons until the right moment." Nodded understanding, "And if it doesn't work?" "Then we try something more direct," Jack said grimly. "The markings you carry contain enough information to disrupt supply lines, interfere with troop movements, and generally make life very difficult for the territorial army. Used carefully, that information could force negotiations even if the military commanders are reluctant." Leaned forward, his expression intense. "You speak of disruption, not destruction. You would have us wound the army, not kill it." "Exactly. Dead soldiers create martyrs and demands for revenge. Confused and frustrated soldiers create demands for new strategies." Jack finished writing and showed the letter to the Apache leader. "The goal is to make the current approach so costly and ineffective that Washington orders a change in policy." The letter was carefully worded to convey urgency without revealing specific sources. Jack described his encounter with Apache representatives who had demonstrated unprecedented knowledge of military plans and capabilities. He warned that continuing current operations would likely result in significant casualties and strategic failures, and he strongly recommended that the colonel request authorization for immediate and discreet negotiations with tribal leaders. "This could work," said after reading the letter, "but only if the colonel is someone who can think beyond simple military solutions." "Colonel Harrison is a career soldier, but he's not stupid," Jack replied. "He knows that his superiors in Washington judge him based on results, not just on following orders. If he can end this conflict through negotiation, it will be better for his career than losing men in a prolonged campaign." "And if he refuses to listen?" one of the younger Apache warriors asked. Jack looked at the intricate markings covering the 3 girls' arms and hands. "Then, we use the information they've gathered to demonstrate exactly what the Apache people are capable of when they have advanced knowledge of military plans." The group spent the rest of the morning working out the details of their unprecedented alliance. It was decided that Jack would return to his normal route, delivering the letter to Fort Apache as if it were a routine dispatch. Meanwhile, would begin reaching out to other Apache bands, sharing selected information from the girls' markings to demonstrate the value of coordination. "This must happen slowly," emphasized. "If too many bands change their tactics at the same time, the army will realize they are facing organized resistance and respond with overwhelming force." nodded agreement. The knowledge we carry is most powerful when used subtly, like poison that weakens an enemy gradually, rather than a blow that kills quickly but alerts everyone to danger. As they prepared to part ways, Jack found himself looking at the three girls with a mixture of admiration and concern. "What you've accomplished is extraordinary," he told them. "But it's also incredibly dangerous if the wrong people learn about those markings." "We know the risks," said quietly. "We accepted them when we chose to escape from the school and return to our people. The knowledge we carry is more important than our individual safety." Stepped forward, holding out her hand to show Jack one particular marking on her palm. This symbol represents something the white teachers at Carlisle talked about often. They called it manifest destiny. The belief that white people are meant to rule this entire continent, that it is their God-given right to take whatever land they want. Jack looked at the symbol, recognizing it as a stylized map showing the planned railroad routes across the Southwest. "I know the concept." "Then you understand why we could not simply submit to their plans for our lives," said. "Manifest destiny means the end of Apache people as anything more than curiosities in their museums. We chose to resist, and we armed ourselves with the most powerful weapon we could find." "Knowledge," Jack said. "Knowledge," confirmed. "My daughter and her friends have given our people something that has been missing from our struggle, understanding of how our enemies think, how they plan, how they can be defeated or convinced to change course." He clasped Jack's shoulder. "Now you offer to help us use that knowledge wisely rather than merely destructively." As Jack prepared to mount Bell for the ride back to Fort Apache, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. What they were attempting had never been tried before. An alliance between a government messenger and Apache resistance leaders, based on intelligence gathered by three remarkable girls who had turned their own bodies into living maps of military secrets. "One more thing," he said, turning back to face the group. "If this works, if we actually manage to arrange negotiations, the girls will need to be protected. There will be people on both sides who won't want peace, who profit from the current conflict. They'll try to eliminate any advantage that threatens their interests." "We have thought of this," replied. "The canyon where we are camped, it connects to a network of hidden places known only to our people. If necessary, the girls and their knowledge can disappear completely until it is safe for them to emerge." "And if negotiations fail?" Jack asked. "If the army refuses to consider any solution except complete surrender?" The Apache leader's expression grew grim. "Then we will use what the girls have given us to fight such a war that the white government will wish it had chosen peace when it had the chance." As Jack rode out of the hidden canyon, his mind was spinning with the implications of what he had committed himself to. In his saddlebags, alongside the official dispatches he was supposed to deliver, he carried a letter that could change the entire nature of the conflict in the Southwest Territory. Behind him, three young Apache girls whose courage and intelligence had already accomplished the impossible were preparing to become the invisible architects of either peace or the most sophisticated guerrilla campaign the American military had ever faced. The next few weeks would determine which future would come to pass. And Jack, a simple territorial messenger who had stumbled into something far larger than himself, had become the crucial link between two worlds that had been at war for generations. As Bell carried him toward Fort Apache and an uncertain future, Jack found himself thinking about the markings that covered the girl's arms and hands. Symbols of knowledge gained through suffering, maps drawn in courage and determination, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, human intelligence and will could find a way to strike back. The Apache girls' markings had become more than just intelligence reports. They had become symbols of hope that a better future was possible, if only people on both sides could find the wisdom to choose it. 3 weeks later, Jack found himself in the most surreal situation of his life, sitting in the commander's office at Fort Apache while Colonel Harrison studied the letter that could change everything. Outside the window, soldiers went about their daily routines, unaware that their future might be decided by a conversation happening just yards away. "Mister," the colonel said finally, looking up from the letter with an expression that mixed skepticism with concern. "This is quite a story you're telling. Apache representatives with detailed knowledge of our operations. Are you certain you weren't being fed false information designed to make us paranoid?" Jack had rehearsed this moment during his ride back to the fort, but actually facing the colonel's questions was more difficult than he had anticipated. "Sir, I've been carrying messages through Apache country for 5 years. I know the difference between bragging and genuine intelligence. What I was shown was real, and it was specific enough to be. Colonel Harrison was a career soldier in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of a man who had spent most of his adult life on frontier posts. He was known for being methodical rather than impulsive, which Jack hoped would work in their favor. "Give me specifics," the colonel said. "What exactly convinced you that these people had access to our plans?" Jack took a deep breath. This was the moment when he would either establish credibility or destroy any chance of success. They knew about the planned supply convoy that's supposed to leave here next Tuesday. They knew the route it was going to take, the size of the escort, and the contents of the wagons. He paused. They also knew about the patrol schedules for the eastern sector, and they had accurate information about troop strength at 3 different outposts. The colonel's expression grew very still. That information is classified. Only a handful of people have access to those details. "Yes, sir, which is why I thought you needed to know about it immediately." Jack leaned forward slightly. "Colonel, what if the Apache people have developed intelligence capabilities we never suspected? What if they're not just reacting to our moves anymore, but actually anticipating them?" Colonel Harrison stood and walked to the window, staring out at the parade ground where soldiers were drilling in the afternoon heat. "If what you're suggesting is true, it would explain some recent complications. Patrols arriving at locations where they expected to find Apache camps, only to discover they had been abandoned just hours before. Supply convoys being watched from concealment by warriors who seemed to know exactly when and where they would pass." Jack felt a surge of hope. The colonel was taking the threat seriously, which was the first step toward considering alternatives to purely military solutions. "Sir, there's something else. The representatives I spoke with indicated they might be willing to discuss terms, but only if they could be certain that any agreements would be honored by Washington." Jack chose his words carefully. They suggested that previous broken treaties had made their people skeptical of traditional diplomatic channels. The colonel turned back to face him. "Are you telling me that these Apache leaders are proposing negotiations?" "I'm saying they might be open to the possibility under the right circumstances." Jack pulled out another piece of paper. "I took the liberty of writing down some thoughts about how such negotiations might be structured if you think the idea has merit." Colonel Harrison read through Jack's proposals with growing interest. The messenger had suggested a series of informal meetings, perhaps with Jack serving as a go-between to establish trust before any official negotiations. The talks would focus on practical issues like ending raids on supply convoys and establishing safe corridors for travel, rather than attempting to resolve larger questions of territorial control immediately. "This is highly irregular," the colonel said. "I don't have authority to negotiate treaties or make agreements about reservation boundaries." "But you do have authority to arrange temporary truces for the protection of military operations," Jack pointed out. "If informal talks could lead to even a few weeks of reduced conflict, that would give you time to request proper authorization from your superiors." The colonel was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of the proposal. Jack waited, knowing that pushing too hard at this point would be counterproductive. "Mister, I'm going to ask you something, and I want a completely honest answer." The colonel's voice was serious. "Is there any possibility that you've been compromised, that these Apache representatives might be using you to feed false information to the Army?" Jack had expected this question, but it still made his stomach clench. His entire plan depended on maintaining the colonel's trust, and any hint of deception could destroy everything. "Sir, I can't prove that I haven't been compromised, any more than you can prove that any of your other sources are reliable," Jack said carefully. "But I can tell you that what I witnessed convinced me that these people have access to accurate intelligence about our operations. Whether they're willing to use that intelligence for cooperation instead of conflict depends on how we respond to their overture." Colonel Harrison studied Jack's face intently, looking for any sign of deception or uncertainty. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. "All right, mister, I'm willing to authorize an exploratory meeting, but with strict conditions. You'll be accompanied by a small escort, and any discussions will be preliminary only. No commitments, no promises about what Washington might or might not approve." Jack felt a surge of relief mixed with nervousness. He had succeeded in the first phase of his plan, But now came the much more difficult task of arranging an actual meeting between representatives of two groups who had been trying to kill each other for years. "There's one more thing, sir," Jack said. "The Apache representatives emphasized that any meetings would have to be conducted in complete secrecy. They're concerned about reactions from both military and Apache warriors who might not support negotiations." "Understood. I'll select the escort personally, people I trust to keep their mouths shut." The colonel walked back to his desk and began writing orders. "How do you propose to reestablish contact with these representatives?" Jack had prepared for this question as well. "They indicated they would be monitoring the area where we met for the next 2 weeks. If I return there with a small group and display a white flag, they should approach us." As Colonel Harrison finished writing his orders, Jack felt the weight of what he was setting in motion. In a few days, he would be leading a small group of soldiers back to the hidden canyon where, and the three remarkable girls were waiting. The success or failure of that meeting could determine whether the conflict in the Southwest Territory escalated into a bloodbath or evolved into something that might eventually resemble peace. 3 days later, Jack found himself riding Bell back toward the canyon, accompanied by Colonel Harrison himself and two trusted sergeants. The colonel had decided that if there was any chance of meaningful negotiations, he needed to be involved personally rather than sending subordinates. "I have to admit, mister," the colonel said as they rode through the familiar landscape, "I'm having second thoughts about this entire enterprise. If we're walking into an ambush, my career will end very abruptly." "If we don't try this, sir, your career might end just as abruptly when Washington decides that the current approach isn't producing acceptable results," Jack replied. "At least this way, we have a chance of finding a solution that doesn't involve years of guerrilla warfare." When they reached the area where Jack had first encountered the Apache band, he dismounted and tied a white cloth to a long stick, holding it high above his head. For several minutes, nothing happened, and Jack began to worry that had decided the risks were too great. Then, as if materializing from the rock itself, Apache warriors began to appear from concealment. Jack counted at least 8, all armed but not immediately threatening, stepped forward, his bearing dignified and calm despite the obvious tension of the situation. "Jack returns with soldiers," the Apache leader said. "Does this mean you bring war or the possibility of peace?" Colonel Harrison urged his horse forward, stopping just outside what he estimated to be effective rifle range. "I am Colonel Harrison, commander of this military district. Mister tells me that you might be willing to discuss ways to reduce the conflict between our peoples." "Your people have a history of making agreements they do not keep," replied. "Why should we believe this time would be different?" It was a fair question, and Jack could see the colonel struggling with how to answer it honestly. The history of broken treaties was undeniable, and everyone present knew it. "Because the alternative is a war that neither of us can win," Colonel Harrison said finally. "You have capabilities we didn't know about, and we have resources you can't match indefinitely. We can destroy each other, or we can find a way to coexist." Studied the colonel for several moments, then gestured toward the hidden canyon. "Come, there are others you should meet if you are serious about understanding what you face." As they rode into the concealed canyon, Jack felt his heart racing. This was the moment when everything they had planned would either begin to work or collapse spectacularly. Colonel Harrison's first sight of the three girls and their intricate markings would either convince him that negotiations were essential or confirm his suspicions that he was being manipulated. When Anne stepped forward to meet the military delegation, Jack watched the colonel's face carefully. He saw surprise, confusion, and then growing amazement as the girls began to explain the nature of the knowledge they carried. "These markings," said, showing the symbols on her arms, "represent 2 years of careful study at your government school in Carlisle. We learned to read your maps, understand your supply systems, and recognize your tactical patterns." She pointed to specific symbols. "We know when your patrols change routes, when your supply convoys travel, and where your weak points are located." Colonel Harrison leaned forward in his saddle, studying the markings with the eye of a professional soldier. "This level of detail? How is it possible?" "Your teachers thought they were civilizing us," explained. "They did not realize they were training us to better resist your advance. Every lesson in geography became knowledge of your territory. Every history lesson taught us how your military thinks. Every mathematics lesson helped us understand your logistics." stepped forward, her large eyes serious. "We offer you a choice, Colonel Harrison. You can continue fighting an enemy who now understands your methods as well as you do, or you can work with us to find a solution that allows both our peoples to survive with dignity." Jack watched as the implications sank in for the colonel. The man was looking at three young girls who had essentially turned themselves into living intelligence manuals, who possessed detailed knowledge that could make any future military campaign far more costly and difficult than anyone in Washington anticipated. "What exactly are you proposing?" Colonel Harrison asked quietly. Stepped forward. "A test of mutual good faith. We use our knowledge to help ensure the safe passage of your supply convoys for 1 month. In return, your patrols avoid areas where our people are gathering food and medicine for the coming winter." He paused. If both sides can honor such an agreement, it might demonstrate that larger negotiations are possible. Colonel Harrison was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of the proposal. Jack held his breath, knowing that the colonel's next words would determine whether their unprecedented alliance had any chance of success. 1 month, the colonel said finally. "A trial period. If it works, I'll recommend to Washington that they authorize formal negotiations." He looked directly at the three girls. "But I want regular proof that your knowledge is genuine, that you're not simply lucky guessers." Smiled for the first time since the delegation had arrived. "You will have your proof, Colonel Harrison, and perhaps by the end of the month, you will understand that the choice is not between victory and defeat, but between wisdom and catastrophe." As the sun began to set over the canyon, Jack realized that against all odds, they had taken the first step toward something that had never existed before. A genuine partnership between Apache intelligence and U.S. military pragmatism, mediated by a territorial messenger who had discovered that sometimes the most important messages are the ones that create new possibilities rather than simply carrying information from one place to another. The Apache girls' markings had indeed become Jack's lifeline, not just to physical survival, but to the hope that even the most intractable conflicts could be transformed when people found the courage to try something unprecedented. Whether that hope would survive the challenges ahead remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, peace seemed like more than just an impossible dream.